Today, I'm approaching my sourdough bread making the way it was made before, let's say, the internet made it very complicated. I'll also talk about everything we can learn from past simplifications, and most importantly, how to apply that old knowledge in a way that makes baking sourdough bread at home today easier for you. It's always interesting to watch the old-fashioned skills become popular again, kind of resurging and even becoming trendy. And sourdough is a good example of that. It made a big comeback now in modern times, but in a very different form, with a very different approach, especially when it comes to how we view our sourdough starters. But before I start baking the old way, I need to make my sourdough just like I usually make it in order to show you the old dough method, which will be the, let's say, the basic concept in this video, because it was the most common way of making sourdough here in Europe for a long time before yeast became popular. So the old dough method essentially means that instead of preparing a sourdough starter, the way modern sourdough baking requires, you save a piece of dough from the previous batch, so raw fermented dough, and then use that piece of dough to leaven the next batch of bread. And this method was used all across Europe under different names. You'll have to excuse my pronunciation a bit, but in France it was called pâté fermenté, in Germany it was called Altteig, and in Italy they called it pasta di riporto. And obtaining some old dough is exactly what you see me doing here in the video. So after I mixed up my usual sourdough bread, let it bulk ferment, and before shaping and baking it, I took a piece of the dough in order to have essentially my starter for the next batch. I have found many different accounts on how they stored that piece, but the common thread was that it was usually in some kind of a bowl covered in flour to prevent it from drying out, or it was even carried in a pouch by women to keep it warm if it was especially cold. I'm lucky enough to still talk with my granddad often, who is 97 years old, and he loves to tell me tales about what growing up was like. He grew up very close to where I live now, and back then this whole area was part of Yugoslavia, so Central/Southern Europe, let's say. And I often ask him about his mother particularly, so that would be my great-grandmother, because I have such deep curiosity and also a deep appreciation for, let's say, the women who came before me, for the skills they had, for knowing how to do things, and for the kind of everyday knowledge that I feel is largely lost today. Just so that there's no confusion, at this point in the video, I'm actually mixing a loaf of 100% fresh milled sourdough bread, partly as a backup, in case this old dough experiment doesn't go well, I'll admit, and partly just because I generally like to bake bread in bulk. Because if I'm already getting my bowls dirty, if I'm turning on my mill and standing behind the counter, I usually like to make at least 2 loaves. And at this point here, I also took a proper look at the old dough. I intentionally didn't look at it too much before because I knew that as long as it was fermenting, it wasn't really that important how fermented it was or how it looked like. And my granddad told me that bread was usually a daily thing, so old dough wouldn't be kept for more than a day ideally. And my husband's grandmother was actually the one who remembered and then mentioned that to me, that old dough was something women would exchange if someone needed it. So if there was a longer pause, maybe someone had a baby or there was a crazy amount of work to do or something like that, they didn't really obsess about preserving the old dough, so they didn't keep a starter like we do today. They simply made peace with not having it. Maybe it over-fermented, maybe it molded, but when they needed it again, there was usually another woman in the village who had some and could help you out. As you can see, the old dough was basically like a very stiff starter. It had great structure, and it was very clearly well fermented. And that's maybe the first thing I wanted to point out in this video in terms of the things that we can learn and simplify. In my eyes, and I'll talk more about that later, but a starter is just dough. I know we think of the starter and the bread dough as two separate things, but they're really not. The only difference is that bread dough has some salt in it and is usually more stiff than the standard runny starter we like to keep today. While mixing up this loaf, I wanted to stay true to the old way of doing sourdough, so I intentionally didn't weigh anything. I just prepared some water in a mason jar and some flour. I also didn't bother with oddities or any of the modern steps we associate with sourdough today. I simply mixed everything together. I do have to mention that I am very used to making sourdough, so I have a good sense of the consistency I'm looking for in the dough, as did women back then, I imagine, if they baked bread without scales every day. You can see me scoring the loaf I took the piece of old dough from, and then I'll also shape and bake the freshly milled loaf before I get back to my sourdough that I'm making using the old dough method. Now, after I mixed all the ingredients for the old dough sourdough, I imagine they were very different ways of going about it. The process was probably done a bit differently from village to village, and even more so from country to country across Europe in terms of how exactly the bread was made. But in my area, it seems that after the ingredients were mixed, there wasn't much kneading involved. So kneading really became more common with the use of yeast. But with sourdough, it seems that the dough was mostly left alone and just tended to a few times. At least that's how some people describe it. So I imagine that tending to the dough probably meant something like stretch and folds. So that's what I went with. I left the dough to bulk ferment like I usually do. And during the first 2 hours of bulk fermentation, I did 2 or 3 sets of stretch and folds. I don't remember exactly, but I believe it was 2. So overall, very hands-off. And regarding the timing of bulk fermentation, I had no real point of reference here since I didn't follow any recipe or measure the ingredients. Normally, when I use my starter, I have a general idea of how long fermentation will take based on how much starter I use and how warm my kitchen is, but this time I really had to rely on observation. So after about 5 hours, I started watching the dough closely for signs that it was fermented enough for me to shape. And again, experience really helped here because I know how properly fermented dough looks like. And once I saw some nice bubbles on the surface and the jiggle was right, I shaped the bread the way I usually do and placed it into a Benetton basket. Now, they obviously didn't have Benetton baskets like we do today, but they did use baskets exclusively for bread. And I imagine those were lined with some kind of cloth as well, simply because it's the practical thing to do. So that's what I did here. Then I scored the bread the way I usually do, basically because I imagined them scoring the bread somehow, but we have no idea to know exactly how. And the result was very, very good. I made a great loaf of bread. If I were being really picky, I'd say it was just slightly under-fermented. So if you noticed, there were a few larger bubbles towards the upper crust of the bread, which is usually a sign of under-fermentation. But overall, it was still very, very good. And it was also surprisingly easy to bake using this old dough method. That said, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for complete beginners. It does require knowing the consistency of the dough you're aiming for, which is very important and crucial, really, for getting the results you want. Now, let's address the most important takeaway from this video. And just to be clear, the point is not that you should bake like this from now on. But what's important is that I feel like this old dough method really highlights one of the most fundamental principles of sourdough baking that doesn't really get talked about today. And that is that the dough and the starter are basically the same thing. And by the way, so you're not confused, you're watching me make my softest sourdough sandwich loaf so far here. I call it the Lazy Tangzong sourdough sandwich bread, and I'll link it down below if you want to take a look. But I really want to expand a bit more on the previous point in this video, so about the dough and the starter being the same thing, because I think it's very important, and people in the past seemed to understand this intuitively and also practically. But today, we often treat starter and bread dough as two completely separate things with separate rules, separate problems, and therefore also separate solutions that we're always looking for. And because of that, we sometimes lose the, let's say, underlying logic that connects everything. But once you understand that your sourdough starter is just dough, sourdough will make a lot more sense because the same principles can be applied to both. I always say sourdough is one of the most flexible things out there, but you do need to understand a few core basics, and those are the same, whether you're talking about starter or dough. Now, if you want to get a bit more practical, Let's take hydration, for example. It's one of the basic principles. I personally don't like keeping a very runny starter, so starter that contains a lot of water and is very pourable. I prefer a stiff starter because it tends to be less acidic and it also ferments more slowly. And you can see the same principle at play when you compare different doughs. So if you use the same amount of starter and the same amount of flour in, let's say, sourdough bread, sourdough focaccia, and sourdough bagels, the focaccia will definitely ferment the fastest because it's very wet. It contains a lot of water. It's very hydrated. The bread will take a bit longer, and the bagels, which are very stiff, not very hydrated, they will take the longest. I can honestly predict how long something will need to ferment just by looking at the recipe, about how much starter is used, how much liquid, are there any fats in there that tend to slow things down a bit. And that's the beauty of sourdough baking. It's very, very easy once you understand the basics and have a bit of experience under your belt. And I guess that's the point of this video. People used to only understand the basics of fermentation, and they created everything without scales, without starter chambers, and all the tools and charts we have today. And my point is that understanding basics about sourdough baking is a bit underrated, especially nowadays, and it helps to return back to them if you feel like your understanding there is lacking. I'll link my sourdough course down below just in case you want to get really deep into sourdough basics. I cover them all there. Let me know if you have any questions about sourdough in general. I'd love to help out if I can in the comments below. Subscribe to see more videos like this, and I hope to see you next Friday. Bye!